Hello and welcome to this video from the Friends of the Wemdon Road Cemetery. So for this series on Bridgwater and the sea, we first need to get to the sea, which means travelling along the River Parrett. Today Bridgwater is 6 miles away from the sea in a straight line, but 14 miles if you go by river. This great river splits Somerset in two. It begins in Dorset and enters Somerset by South Parrett, and flows for around 35 miles before reaching the sea at Burnham, channeled through the treacherous Gore Sands. It is joined by the rivers Yeo and Isle before Langport, then joined by the River Tone and Carey on the Somerset levels. The name is a mystery. Almost all place names in the immediate Bridgwater area are English or have Old English origins, and almost all the Old Brythonic, Old Welsh names have been erased. All that is except for the name Parrett. Although the exact meaning is forgotten and now unknown, the best guess is that it means something like boundary or partition. This recalls how the River Parrett was for a time the boundary between the Britons of Devon, as in the Old Welsh, in the west, and the English West Saxons in the east. But this name may also go back further to when the river apparently divided the ancient Devoni people from the Durotriges in ancient times. Bridgwater was the furthest point inland where ocean-going, although primarily coastal vessels, could reach before being stopped by the town bridge. Here they would be unloaded and the goods either brought to market, taken overland, or put onto barges to take upriver. The barges seen in these pictures probably had two functions, as these served the brickyards. So they would take coal from the ships that arrived by sea, and then they would return with the brick and tiles for the journey in the opposite direction. So there are two fundamental problems about travelling from Bridgwater to the sea by river. The first is the nature of the river, the second is the course of the river. So first, the Bristol Channel has the second largest tidal range in the world, rising and falling by 45 feet. The Parrett shares this great range and also is tidal all the way up to Langport. This causes three problems for shipping. The first is that the river flows in two directions depending on the time of day, so your movement is entirely dependent on the incoming or the outgoing tides. Second, the river rises and falls by a huge margin. So although you may sail in at high tide, if there's an exceptionally low tide, your vessel will end up resting on the riverbed. At worst, your ship may topple over. At best, the uneven nature of the bank means you'll be applying pressure to the hull, which won't be doing it any good. Third, and most famously, there's the bore. This pedestrian-paced tidal wave is usually 3 to 4 feet high, but can get up to 9 feet in exceptional circumstances. These rather gentle pitches don't really do it justice. The violence of such a wave can be troubling for little vessels on the river, and won't be any good for the maintenance of larger ones. On the 14th of July 1645, during the Civil Wars, Sir Thomas Fairfax and Oliver Cromwell were almost killed by the bore when their boat capsized at Dunware when they were trying to cross the river during the storm of Bridgwater. At the time, the bore was known as the Eager. So the second problem with navigating the Parrett is its course. I said before that Bridgwater is 6 miles away from the sea in a straight line, but 14 miles by river. Well, it used to be much worse than this. The river would rise, flood and fall into different channels, and it's only through the human taming of the landscape that the river has been constrained and largely fixed into place. If we take the 1854 round map of the district, we can trace the river more or less as we know it today. The thing to keep in mind here is that the river has been shaped by man for a very long time now, and it has been firmly cast into this shape. Naturally, the river would have moved and constantly changed. To give you an idea, we can try to reconstruct something of the old Wild River using parish boundaries, at least the parish boundaries preserved up to the 1840s, and there's been a lot of chopping and changing since. The parishes of Britain were formed around 1,000 years ago, and their boundaries often fossilise clues to an older landscape. In one of those bizarre legal situations, it was actually easier to change the physical course of the river than it was to change the legal parish boundaries, so you would often get some interesting anachronisms preserved over the centuries. So to start, down by Dunware, on the north bank of the Parrett, a chunk of land lay in the parish of North Peverton, but there seems little reason for this to be the case today. The most obvious answer for what's going on here is that there was once a loop in the Parrett in this location, surrounding this bit of land, but after the river was straightened, that piece of land found itself detached from its old parish. If we now look downriver, there was once a huge loop in the Parrett by Dumble, which stretched almost to the flat land below Crandon Bridge. The Bristol Road was not laid out until 1829, and its course would have been impossible in the previous centuries. This loop had been straightened between 1677 and 1678 under the supervision of Sir John Moulton, reclaiming 150 acres in the process. It apparently took almost 20 years for the old course of the river to silt up, and it is more or less invisible today. Next, if we look at the old parish of Wemdon, we see it once included the manor of Sydenham, which today lies firmly on the opposite bank of the River Parrett. This makes a bit more sense when we take into account the nearby place name of Horsey, which means Horse Island, and another settlement called Piggins, which meant Pig Island. So it is likely that the Parrett once had several channels, which created little islands. Over time, these channels either silted up or were blocked by man, so the river eventually became tamed into one. So, using the old parish boundary, we can draw on a second course of the river, and then maybe a third, as the parish of Chiltern Trinity had some similar peculiar boundaries as well. And if you're looking for parallels to what's going on here, there's been some interesting research in recent years onto the floodplain of the River Danube, showing how a huge wiggly mess of watercourses has now been tamed into one boring straight line. Finally, we can trace a kink in the river at Hamp being straightened in 1568, which is possibly fossilised in the course of the old Taunton Road. So much of the history of Bridgwater has been an attempt to foster trade on the river while trying to work around the problems the river presents. So simplifying the course of the river was probably the most obvious action, but there are lots of other little workarounds, and I'll just briefly outline them here. The tidal range of the river was dealt with in a couple of ways. In the town itself, the quays were gradually built up and straightened, and silt gradually removed from below them, meaning ships could more safely settle on the riverbed at low tides, causing as little damage as possible. In 1874, a timber cradle, known as a gridiron, was also built along East Quay to safely support vessels at low tide, and would also allow maintenance to be performed at the same time. And this structure is presumably still there under all that mud. A dry dock had also been built on East Quay back in 1790, where vessels could sail in, be supported, then the water flushed away to allow more substantial maintenance work, and this site is now where the Asda petrol pumps stand today. The town also possessed a steam-powered tug, which could tow sailing vessels up and down the river regardless of the wind or the tide, and this could reduce the journey time from Burnham to Bridgwater by almost a whole day. However, the largest initiative to work around the problems of the river came with the canal and the docks. In 1827, the canal was built between Taunton and Huntworth, and barges made the final stretch to Bridgwater along the Parrett. This drastically improved inland communications, and in 1840 the canal was continued and looped around the town to reach the floating harbour, also known as the docks. These were a huge advance in the old ways of doing things, providing permanent tide-proof moorings for ocean-going vessels with a much larger capacity compared to the old quay size. The docks didn't replace the river. I'll talk more about the docks another time, but it is worth remembering that they were initially envisaged as part of a further scheme which would have cut another larger ship canal along the countryside in a straight line to Cummich. However, in the end this scheme proved far too costly. Despite its awkward river, Bridgwater was still a thriving port up to 1900, and scenes like this were still common up to the First World War. However, after the war, and especially after the Second World War, the lorry and the motorway would ultimately kill the river trade entirely. I'll leave this short introduction here for today. Having now laid out the basics of the use of the river and the problems behind it, I'll return next time with stories of the mariners and traders who made their lives on the river. As always, you can support the Friends in the usual ways, by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, becoming a member of the Friends, or by buying one of our books. Apologies there haven't been more videos of late, but I'm working hard to upgrade the Friends website, which will hopefully be live soon. In the meantime, wishing you all the very best.